The iron gates of Oakwood Cemetery were still open when I finally turned away from Richard's grave. The November wind cut through my black coat like a blade, carrying with it the last of the fallen leaves that had settled on the fresh mound of dark earth where my husband of 34 years now rested. I had stayed long after everyone else had gone, long after the priest had offered his final condolences, long after the funeral director had quietly retreated to his black car, long after the last distant cousin had pressed my hand and murmured something forgettable about heaven and peace. I had stayed because I needed those final minutes alone with the man who had been my partner, my confidant, my anchor in every storm life had thrown at us. I pressed my gloved hand flat against the cold marble headstone and whispered things I will never repeat to another living soul. Then I straightened my spine, picked up my purse, and walked back to the waiting car. I should have known something was wrong the moment the driver turned onto Elmwood Drive, and I saw that the lights of the house were all on, every single window blazing against the gray afternoon sky. Richard and I had lived in that house for 26 years. A Georgian colonial with white columns and a circular driveway lined with oak trees that Richard had planted himself the spring after we moved in. He had been so proud of those trees. In November they stood bare and skeletal, their branches reaching upward like hands frozen, mid-prayer. The driver pulled up to the front steps and I climbed out, still wrapped in the particular exhaustion that follows a day of public grief. The kind of tiredness that lives not in your muscles but somewhere deeper, in the marrow of you. I was reaching into my purse for my house key when the front door opened. Brandon stood in the doorway first. My son, 31 years old, broad-shouldered, wearing the same dark suit he had worn at the funeral, but with the tie loosened now, as though the performance of mourning was already behind him. Behind him stood Courtney, his wife, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression carefully neutral in the way of someone who has rehearsed a scene. And to Brandon's right stood my daughter, Erica, 28 years old. She had Richard's eyes and my stubbornness, and right now those eyes were hard and flat as winter ice. At Erica's feet sat a suitcase. My suitcase. The large burgundy one with the gold clasps that Richard had given me for our 25th anniversary. The one I had taken to Paris, to Rome, to the Amalfi Coast. It sat on the top step like a period at the end of a sentence. "Mom," Brandon said, and his voice had a quality I had never heard in it before. A kind of practiced steadiness, the voice of someone who has decided something and will not be moved. "We need to talk." I looked at the suitcase. I looked at my son. I looked at my daughter, who would not quite meet my eyes. I looked at Courtney, who would. "Your good life is over," Brandon said. "Get out of our house." If you are watching this story for the first time, please take a moment right now to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. It takes 2 seconds, and it means the world. And drop a comment below, telling me, have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely? Because what happened to me will show you that no matter how dark the moment, the truth always finds its way to the light. Stay with me, because this story is only just beginning. I did not cry. I want you to understand that clearly, because people who heard this story later always assumed I must have broken down on those steps, must have begged or screamed or, at the very least, let my voice shake. I did none of those things. Something happened inside me in that moment. Something clicked into place like a lock turning. And I felt, beneath the grief and the shock and the cold November air, a deep and absolute calm. The kind of calm that only comes when you already know something the other person doesn't. I looked at my children for a long moment. Then I picked up the suitcase, turned around, and walked back down the steps to the waiting car. Behind me, I heard Brandon say something to Erica, something low, and then I heard laughter. Not cruel laughter exactly. Satisfied laughter. The laughter of people who believe they have won. They had no idea what I was carrying. But let me go back to the beginning, because you need to understand the full weight of what happened that day. You need to understand who Richard was, and who I was, and how we built the life that my children decided was theirs to take. I grew up in a small house in Pasadena, California, the middle daughter of a high school history teacher and a woman who gave piano lessons out of the living room. We were not poor, but money was always a conversation in our house. A careful, slightly anxious conversation that shaped the way I understood the world. I learned early that security did not simply happen to you. You built it, brick by brick, decision by decision, through patience and discipline, and the willingness to defer pleasure today for stability tomorrow. I was 22 years old, fresh out of USC with a degree in business administration, working my first real job at a mid-sized investment firm in downtown Los Angeles, when I met Richard Calloway. He was 30 years old, already running his own commercial real estate development company, and he walked into the firm where I worked to discuss a potential investment and sat across the conference table from me with the particular energy of a man who was accustomed to being the most purposeful person in any room. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He was precise and focused, and when he looked at you completely, as though you were the only thing in the room worth paying attention to. He asked me to dinner 3 days later. I said yes because I had learned to recognize quality, and Richard Calloway was quality through and through. We dated for 2 years. Careful years, honest years, years in which we learned each other, with the thoroughness of people who intended to stay. Richard was not a man who did anything halfway, and when he decided that I was the person he wanted to spend his life with, he committed to that decision with the same disciplined focus he brought to every project he undertook. He proposed on a Tuesday evening in his apartment, with no fanfare, no restaurant, no audience. Just the two of us, and a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, and a question asked with such simple sincerity that I cried for 10 minutes before I could answer. We were married in the spring of 1991 in a small ceremony in Santa Barbara. Richard's parents came from Chicago. My family drove up from Pasadena. There were 40 people in attendance, and a reception that ran 4 hours longer than planned because nobody wanted to leave. Brandon was born the following year. Erica arrived 3 years after that. By the time Erica started walking, Richard's company had completed its first major project, a mixed-use development in Burbank that established his reputation in the industry and laid the financial foundation for everything that followed. We moved from our rental house in Silver Lake to the Georgian Colonial on Elmwood Drive in Pasadena when Brandon was 6 and Erica was 3. And I remember the afternoon we got the keys, standing in the empty foyer with Richard's arm around my shoulders and both children running from room to room, their footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors, and thinking, this is what we built. This is ours. I want to be honest about something, because this story deserves honesty. Richard and I were not perfect parents. We were present, genuinely, consistently present in a way I was proud of. But we also had resources, and resources can be a form of insulation, a padding between children and the natural consequences of their choices. Richard believed in generosity. He was the child of a man who had worked a factory floor for 30 years, and he had absorbed from that upbringing a deep commitment to ensuring that his own children would never want for anything. It was a generous impulse, a loving impulse, and I shared it. But looking back now, with the clarity that only hindsight provides, I wonder whether we also gave our children too soft a relationship with difficulty, Whether we protected them, inadvertently, from the particular education that comes from struggling and failing and finding your own way back. Brandon had gone to USC, as I had, and then to business school at UCLA. He had worked for 2 years at a commercial real estate firm before Richard brought him into Callaway Development, the company Richard had spent 30 years building. I had supported that decision. Richard had been excited about it. Brandon had Richard's instincts, or so we believed, and the idea of a family legacy, of handing something extraordinary to the next generation, was deeply meaningful to both of us. Erica had gone to NYU for her undergraduate degree, spent 4 years in New York working in arts administration, and then returned to Los Angeles 2 years ago when she married a man named Davis Cho, who worked in entertainment law. Erica had never shown much interest in the business. She had her father's eye for beauty and her own complicated relationship with the commercial world. But she and Davis lived comfortably, and Richard and I helped them with the down payment on their house in Hancock Park, as we had helped Brandon and Courtney with theirs in San Marino. We were a close family, or I believed we were. Sunday dinners at the house on Elmwood Drive, Christmas in Montecito, where we had a second property, summer vacations that rotated between the Pacific Coast and Europe. Richard coached Brandon's Little League teams when the kids were young. I drove Erica to her ballet lessons every Tuesday and Thursday for 7 years. We were the kind of family that appears in the holiday photographs people use as screensavers, coordinated and smiling, and visibly, genuinely at ease with each other. I am telling you all of this because I need you to understand the magnitude of what I missed. I need you to understand that the seeds of what happened at those front steps on the day of Richard's funeral had been planted long before Richard got sick, long before the diagnosis, long before any of us understood that our time together was running out. And I, who prided myself on perception, who had spent a career reading balance sheets and spotting the hidden assumptions in financial projections, had failed entirely to read the people who shared my blood and my table and my home. Richard was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 14 months before he died. Stage 3. The oncologist was a careful, measured man who explained our options with the precision of someone who has delivered this particular category of news many times and has learned that false hope is its own cruelty. Richard listened to everything the doctor said with his hands folded in his lap and his face composed. And when the appointment was over and we were sitting in the car in the hospital parking structure, he turned to me and said, "Well, we have work to do." That was Richard. No performance, no collapse, no existential theater. Just the immediate pivot to action, to the practical, to what needed to be done. What needed to be done, in Richard's view, was first to fight the illness as aggressively and intelligently as possible, and second to ensure that everything he had spent his life building was properly protected and properly distributed. He began treatment immediately. Surgery followed by chemotherapy, a brutal regimen that he endured with a stoicism that made the nurses on his treatment floor shake their heads in something between admiration and concern. And in parallel, he began meeting with our estate attorney, a man named Gerald Hoffman, who had handled Richard's legal affairs for 20 years. I was present at some of those meetings, not all of them. This is something I have turned over in my mind many times since. The meetings I attended and the ones I did not. The documents I reviewed and the ones I trusted Richard to handle, because he had always handled them, and I had always trusted him. We had a partnership built on mutual confidence, Richard and I. He trusted my judgment in certain domains, and I trusted his in others. And for 34 years that arrangement had served us beautifully. What I did not know, what I would not discover until much later, was that during those 14 months of illness, something had changed in my household that I was too focused on caregiving to see. I was Richard's primary caregiver. I want you to understand what that means in concrete terms. It means I was present at every chemotherapy infusion, sitting in the chair beside his recliner for hours at a time, reading aloud to him when he wanted distraction, and sitting in companionable silence when he didn't. It means I managed his medications, a complex rotating schedule of anti-nausea drugs and steroids, and pain management that required the organizational precision of a logistics operation. It means I coordinated with the home health aides, the oncologist's office, the nutritionist, the palliative care team. It means I held his hand through the nights when the pain was bad and the morphine hadn't yet taken the edge off, and I told him stories about our life together to give him something to hold on to. It means I was exhausted in a way that goes beyond physical exhaustion, in a way that hollows you out at the cellular level. And while I was doing all of that, my children were in my house. They had both moved back to Elmwood Drive in the first weeks after Richard's diagnosis, ostensibly to help, to be close to their father, to support the family through what was coming. Brandon and Courtney took the East Guest Suite. Erica and Davis took the West one. I was grateful for their presence. I was grateful not to be alone in that house with the weight of what was happening. I did not understand then that their presence served a purpose beyond family loyalty. The first sign, and I can see it so clearly now, in retrospect, with the awful clarity of hindsight, came about 6 months into Richard's illness. I had been up most of the night with him, a difficult night, and I had finally managed to sleep for a few hours in the early morning. When I came downstairs around 9 o'clock, I found Brandon in Richard's study. He was sitting at Richard's desk, not doing anything I could specifically object to, just sitting there, in Richard's chair, looking at something on his phone. But when he heard me come in, he stood up quickly with a small startled movement that was entirely unlike his usual ease, and he said, "Mom, hey, I needed to use the printer," and gestured vaguely at the printer on the side table. I looked at the printer. It had clearly not been recently used. I looked at my son. I said something unremarkable, something like, "Of course, help yourself," and went to make coffee. But the image stayed with me, that small involuntary flinch, that too quick explanation, and filed itself away in a corner of my mind where I stored things I didn't yet know what to do with. The second sign came 2 months later. I overheard a conversation I was not meant to hear. I had come in through the side door from the garden, something I rarely did, and I heard Brandon's voice from the sitting room. Not his normal speaking voice, but a lower, more intense register, the voice of someone arguing without wanting to be heard arguing. "It has to be ironclad," he was saying. "There can't be any ambiguity. If there's any ambiguity, she'll find it." And then Courtney's voice, quieter, and I couldn't make out the words, and then silence. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I walked into the kitchen, made noise with the kettle, announced my presence loudly enough that whoever was in the sitting room would know I was back in the house. When Brandon appeared in the kitchen doorway a few minutes later, he was entirely composed. He asked how my walk had been. I told him fine. I made us both tea. We talked about his father's last oncology appointment, and the conversation I had overheard sat in that corner of my mind alongside the incident with the printer. 2 data points I didn't yet have the context to connect. I was too tired. I want to be honest about this, too. I was too exhausted, too consumed by the daily crisis of Richard's declining health, to give those data points the attention they deserved. There is only so much a human mind can hold at once, and mine was already holding everything it could. Richard died on a Thursday morning in September, at home, in our bedroom, with me holding one hand and Brandon holding the other. Erica sat at the foot of the bed. Davis and Courtney waited in the hallway. The hospice nurse was present. It was, as these things sometimes mercifully are, a peaceful passage. His breathing slowed, and then it stopped, and the room held a quality of stillness that I have never experienced before or since. I sat with him for a long time after. The children gave me that space, at least. Whatever they were planning, they gave me that. The funeral was 4 days later. 200 people came to the church, which surprised me only in that I had somehow forgotten, in the tunnel of caregiving, how many lives Richard had touched. Colleagues and competitors and the men who had worked construction on his earliest projects. Neighbors and childhood friends who had flown in from Chicago. The couple we had befriended 20 years ago, on a cruise and seen every year since. The eulogies were kind and true. The music was what Richard had requested. He had been characteristically precise about this, had left a handwritten list with Gerald Hoffman. I sat in the front pew between Brandon and Erica, and I held myself together with everything I had, because Richard had asked me to. "Don't fall apart in public," he had said, during one of our late-night conversations near the end. "You can fall apart with me, but not in public. You're too dignified for that." So I was dignified. It cost me everything I had. After the burial, after I had stayed alone at the graveside in the cold November afternoon, after the driver had brought me back to Elmwood Drive, you know what happened next. You know about the suitcase on the top step and my son's flat rehearsed voice and the laughter that followed me down the driveway. What you don't know yet is what was in that suitcase. They had packed it for me. I understood that immediately. The burgundy suitcase had been taken from the storage room, where it lived and packed with a selection of my clothing and personal items, carefully enough to suggest that someone had thought about it. Not carefully enough to suggest that someone had thought about it with any genuine knowledge of what I actually needed. There were 3 black dresses, and 2 pairs of shoes, and my jewelry box. Not the real jewelry box. The decoy one I kept on the dresser, but not the one in the safe in the closet floor. There was a toiletry bag assembled from the guest bathroom supplies. There was a framed photograph of Richard and me from our 25th anniversary trip to Italy, which I chose to interpret as either sentimentality or an oversight, and I still don't know which. What they did not know, what they could not have known, was that 3 weeks before Richard died, on a Thursday afternoon while Brandon had taken Richard to what would turn out to be his second-to-last oncology appointment, Gerald Hoffman had come to the house and sat with me in the kitchen and placed a manila envelope on the table between us. "Richard asked me to give you this," Gerald said. "He was very specific about the timing, after he was gone, before anything else happened." Gerald was a man in his late 60s, spare and precise, with the contained affect of someone who has spent a career being trusted with other people's most consequential decisions. He looked at me across the table with something in his eyes that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, and was perhaps some mixture of both. He said you would know what to do with it. I had opened the envelope at the kitchen table while Gerald waited, and I had read what was inside, and then I had read it again, and then I had sat very quietly for a moment, while the information reorganized itself into something I could hold. Then I had looked at Gerald and said, "How long have you known?" "Richard told me everything about 8 months ago," Gerald said. "He had been aware of certain things for a while before that." And he didn't tell me. He didn't want to burden you while you were caring for him, and he wanted to handle it properly. He wanted it to be airtight. I had nodded slowly. I had looked out the kitchen window at the oak trees Richard had planted, bare and grey in the October light. I had thought about everything I knew about my husband, his precision, his patience, his absolute refusal to do anything halfway. And I had understood that what was in that envelope was not a document he had assembled in panic or illness. It was the product of a man who had seen clearly, thought clearly, and acted with his characteristic thoroughness, even as his body was failing him. "He said to tell you one more thing," Gerald said. "He said, she already knows how to win. She just needs the proof." I had folded the envelope and placed it in the inside pocket of my cardigan, directly against my chest. And when Brandon came home with Richard an hour later, I had been at the stove making soup, and I had smiled at my husband as he came through the door, and he had looked at me with the particular look he reserved for moments when we understood each other completely, a look that said everything and required no words. That envelope had been in my possession for 3 weeks. I had moved it from the cardigan pocket to a zippered interior compartment of my everyday handbag, and when my children packed that suitcase for me, presumably having searched my usual places, the bedside drawer, the desk in the study, the filing cabinet in the home office, they had not thought to search the bag I was carrying on my arm when I walked up those front steps. And when they handed me the suitcase and told me my good life was over, they did not notice me reach into my handbag and, in the brief moment of reaching for my sunglasses, transfer the envelope to the zippered interior pocket of the suitcase itself, right there, 3 feet from my son's face, while Courtney watched from the doorway and Erica looked at the middle distance. It took 4 seconds. I walked to the car. The driver, a man named Marcus, who had worked for our family for 11 years and who had, when I called him that morning to ask if he would be available, said, "Mrs. Calloway, I'll be wherever you need me," with a steadiness in his voice that had nearly undone me, opened the door. I got in. He closed it. As we drove away from Elmwood Drive, I reached into the suitcase and took out the envelope and held it in my lap. Outside the window, the oak trees of the neighborhood passed by one, bare against the November sky. I called Gerald Hoffman from the car. "They did it," I said when he picked up. A brief silence. Then, "Are you all right?" "I'm completely fine," I said. And I meant it. "How soon can we move?" "I've been ready for 3 weeks," Gerald said. "Richard made sure of that." Of course he had. Now let me tell you what was in that envelope, and what my children had actually done, and why Richard had spent the last year of his life building an invisible architecture of protection around the woman he loved. Richard had become aware, approximately 10 months before he died, that Brandon had been systematically working to consolidate control of Calloway Development in ways that went significantly beyond anything Richard had authorized. Brandon had, over the course of approximately 18 months, leveraged his position as Richard's son and apparent successor to make a series of representations to key stakeholders: minority shareholders, the company's primary lender, 2 major development partners. That implied Richard was already stepping back from active leadership, and that Brandon was, in practical terms, running the company. He had done this subtly enough that no single action was obviously improper, but cumulatively the effect was to position himself as the de facto principal of a company that was not his. This alone would have been manageable. Richard had dealt with ambitious people his entire career. What made it something else entirely was the second part: Brandon and Erica. And here is where it had broken Richard's heart. I could see it in the letter he had written me that was also in the envelope. A letter I will describe to you properly in a moment. Brandon and Erica had together engaged an attorney who specialized in elder law and estate litigation. They had consulted this attorney about the possibility of challenging Richard's estate plan on the grounds of diminished capacity, the argument being that Richard's illness had affected his judgment, and that therefore any estate planning decisions made during that period should be revisited. They had engaged this attorney before Richard was even close to the end. They had done it while he was still well enough to drive himself to chemotherapy appointments, while he was still sharp enough to restructure a development deal and win. And they had done one more thing. Through Courtney's brother, who worked in finance, Brandon had gained access to information about a secondary account Richard maintained, a personal investment account separate from the business accounts, and had made an attempt to initiate a transfer of assets from that account that he was not authorized to make. The attempt had been flagged and stopped by the bank, and Richard had been notified, and that was the moment. Richard described it in his letter as the moment I understood what we were dealing with. That Richard had called Gerald Hoffman and said, "Gerald, I need to restructure everything, and I need to do it so that it cannot be touched." Gerald had spent the next 8 months doing exactly that. What they did not know, what my children and the attorney they had hired and Courtney's brother in finance had collectively failed to account for, was that Richard Calloway had not built a real estate empire worth $43 million by being careless about paperwork. The estate plan they thought they were going to challenge was not, in fact, the operative estate plan. Richard, with Gerald's assistance, had executed a new and comprehensive estate plan 8 months before his death, during a period when he was, by any medical or legal standard, entirely competent. His oncologist had documented this specifically, at Gerald's request, in records that were now part of the legal file. This new estate plan had been designed with the explicit understanding that it might face challenge, and it had been structured accordingly, with every element supported by documentation, witness signatures, notarized affidavits, and the kind of evidentiary redundancy that reflected both Gerald's legal expertise and Richard's instinct for structural integrity. The house on Elmwood Drive was not, as my children believed, part of Richard's estate. It had been transferred via a properly executed deed and the payment of appropriate taxes into a trust of which I was the sole trustee and sole beneficiary 8 months ago. My children had been living for the past several months in my house. The house they had just locked me out of was mine. The Montecito property had been handled the same way. The primary investment accounts had been restructured so that Brandon's attempted access was not merely unsuccessful but had generated a paper trail that Gerald's team had since developed into a fraud referral that was currently sitting with the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. Calloway Development was, in its ownership structure, exactly as Richard had always intended, held in a family trust with me as the controlling trustee and both children as beneficiaries, with specific provisions regarding governance that made Brandon's self-appointment as de facto leader legally meaningless, and with the minority shareholders and development partners having been quietly, personally briefed by Richard in the final months. Visits I had not been told about at the time. Visits Richard had made on the days when he insisted he was well enough to go out alone, and I should rest. He had gone to tell people the truth about what was happening in his company, and to ensure that when the time came, there would be no confusion about who held legitimate authority. And then there was the letter. Richard had written me a letter, 8 pages in his handwriting. The handwriting that had grown somewhat unsteady toward the end but was still unmistakably his. That precise, slightly architectural script, every letter formed with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. The letter was about many things. It was about his life and what it had meant to him. It was about us, about 34 years of a marriage that he described with a specificity and tenderness that I will not share with you, because it belongs to me. It is the most private thing I own, and I intend to keep it that way. It was about Brandon and Erica, about his love for them, his grief at what they had done, his inability to fully understand it, and his unwillingness to pretend to. He wrote, "I keep trying to find the moment where I failed them, where we failed them, and I cannot locate it. I don't know if that means we didn't fail them, or if it means the failure was so early and so ordinary that it has become invisible to me. I have made peace with not knowing." And then there was one paragraph near the end of the letter, just one, that I have read so many times since that I have it memorized. He wrote, "Michelle, you have always been the stronger of the two of us, even though you were too gracious to say so, and I was too proud to fully acknowledge it until now. What I have built for you is not a weapon. It is a shield, and a foundation, and a door. What you choose to do with it is entirely up to you. But I know you. You will choose rightly. You always have." I sat in the back of Marcus's car and I read that paragraph and I let myself cry for exactly 5 minutes. Then I put the letter back in the envelope, put the envelope back in the zippered pocket of the suitcase, and called Gerald Hoffman. We moved quickly because we had been ready to move for 3 weeks. Gerald filed the necessary documents with the county recorder's office the following morning, formalizing the trust transfers and establishing the record of ownership that would form the foundation of everything that followed. He also formally activated the fraud referral with the DA's office, submitting the documentation Richard's team had compiled regarding the unauthorized account access. And he notified the elder care attorney my children had retained that their client's grounds for an incapacity challenge had precisely 0 legal merit, and that any attempt to file such a challenge would be met with a counter-filing that would be, in Gerald's measured phrasing, comprehensive and uncomfortable. I stayed those first few nights at the Four Seasons in Beverly Hills, which felt surreal in the way that all luxury feels surreal when you are in the middle of a crisis. Simultaneously too much and not enough. Gerald called twice a day with updates. Marcus drove me wherever I needed to go. I began to make calls of my own. The first call was to the managing director of Callaway Development's primary lender, a man named Thomas Chen, who had worked with Richard for 15 years and who picked up on the second ring when he saw my name. I told him, calmly and concisely, what had happened and what was going to happen. He listened without interrupting, and then said, "Mrs. Callaway, I have been waiting for this call for 6 months. Richard asked me to extend you every cooperation." He was as good as his word. The second call was to the 2 development partners who were currently mid-project with Callaway. Both conversations were similar. Both men had been briefed by Richard. Both expressed variations of the same sentiment. "We were never comfortable with how this was being handled. We are glad you called." The third call was to the minority shareholders. There were 4 of them, and I called each one personally. These calls took longer because they required more explanation. But by the end of each conversation, the picture was clear. Brandon had made representations to them that were not authorized, and the controlling trustee of the company was me, and the company was going to continue to operate exactly as Richard had built it. It took 11 days. On the 12th day, Gerald sent formal written notice to my children at the address on Elmwood Drive, my address, though they didn't know it yet, advising them that the property had been owned by the Michelle Callaway, revocable trust for the past 8 months, that their occupancy of the property was therefore at my discretion, and that they had 30 days to make alternative living arrangements. I am told that Brandon received that letter on a Tuesday morning. I am told this because the housekeeper, a woman named Rosa, who had worked for us for 16 years and who had called me in tears 2 days after I'd left, to tell me what had happened, and to say that she had been watching what was going on in that house for months, and that she had things to tell me. Rosa called to let me know that Brandon had read the letter in the kitchen, and that the sound he made when he finished reading it was something she didn't have words for. I want to be honest with you about something. I did not feel the satisfaction I thought I would feel when I heard that. Or rather, I felt it and immediately felt something else alongside it. Something that was not quite sadness and not quite grief, but was perhaps the specific weight of understanding. My children had done something I could not forgive, but they were still my children. They were still the small people I had driven to school and helped with homework and held when they were sick and cheered at their graduations. Whatever they had become, whatever calculation or entitlement or fear had led them to stand in my husband's doorway the day of his funeral and tell me my good life was over, they had once been the best thing Richard and I had ever made. The weight of that didn't disappear. It just had to coexist with everything else. The legal proceedings were not quick. They never are. Brandon, to his credit, or perhaps to the credit of the attorney he retained once Gerald's team made the situation clear, did not fight the ownership issues. The deed was the deed. The trust documents were the trust documents. These things were not ambiguous. What took time was the fraud matter, the DA's review, the civil proceedings that Gerald filed to formally address the unauthorized account access. These things moved at the pace that legal systems move, which is to say, slowly, methodically, and ultimately, with a finality that cannot be appealed on emotional grounds. Erica called me 4 months after the funeral. I did not expect the call, and I was not prepared for it, and when her name appeared on my phone screen, I sat with it for 3 full rings before I answered. She was crying before she said a word. She said, "Mom, I need you to know that I told Brandon it was wrong. I need you to know that I said no, and then I said nothing, and I should have said something to you, and I didn't, and I don't know how to. And then she couldn't continue for a moment. I listened. I didn't say anything immediately, because there was nothing to say immediately that would have been both true and kind. I waited until she had said everything she needed to say, which took a long time, and involved crying and long silences, and a kind of honesty that was, I thought, the most real conversation we had had in years, maybe ever. When she was done, I said, "Erica, I know you were afraid of Brandon. I know you have always been afraid of disappointing him, but you are not absolved by fear. You will need to do something real with your remorse, over time, in order for us to find our way through this. I'm not able to give you forgiveness today, but I'm not closed to it. That's the most I can offer you right now," she said. "I know. I understand. Thank you for answering. I have not spoken to Brandon. He has not called. I moved back into the house on Elmwood Drive in February, 4 months after I had been walked out of it. Rosa had kept it in perfect order. The oak trees Richard had planted were beginning to show the first signs of spring. Tiny green buds at the tips of the bare branches, so small you had to look for them. I stood in the foyer with my suitcase. The burgundy one, the one with the gold clasps, the one that had carried the envelope. And I looked up the staircase and down the hall, toward the kitchen and through the back windows toward the garden, and I allowed myself to feel all of it. The grief and the love and the rage and the relief and the particular, complicated peace of being in your own home. I still run Callaway Development, not in a hands-on way. I hired a president, a woman in her 50s with 30 years of industry experience, who Richard would have respected. But as controlling trustee, I am involved in every significant decision. Richard's company is intact. More than intact. In fact, we closed 2 new development agreements in the months after Richard's death, partly because his careful final months of relationship management had left the company's partnerships on firmer ground than they would otherwise have been. The fraud matter was resolved with a civil settlement that I will not detail beyond saying that it was substantial, and that its terms included a period of supervised financial reporting for Brandon that I expect will concentrate his attention considerably. The elder care attorney my children had retained withdrew from the case before filing anything. The incapacity challenge, which had no merit to begin with, was never filed. Davis and Erica separated 6 months after the funeral. I do not know what role the events of that time played in that, and I have not asked. I am 58 years old. I live in the house on Elmwood Drive with Rosa, who has agreed to stay on in an expanded role, and with the oak trees in the garden that Richard planted 30 years ago, and which are, this spring, fuller and more beautiful than I have ever seen them. I have lunch with Gerald Hoffman once a month. I have dinner with Marcus and his wife twice a year, a tradition we started after I sent him a bottle of Burgundy, with a note that said only, "Thank you for being ready." He called to tell me it was the best wine he had ever had. I told him it was the least I could offer. I think about Richard every day. I think about the 8 pages in his handwriting, which I keep in a fireproof box in the closet, alongside the envelope and the trust documents, and all the other pieces of the architecture he built to protect me. I think about the fact that in the worst year of his life, weakened and in pain and facing what he knew was coming, he spent his remaining energy not in bitterness or despair, but in careful, loving, practical action on behalf of the person he had chosen 34 years ago in a Santa Barbara garden. I think about what it means to be truly known by another person, to have someone see you clearly enough to understand not just what you need in a crisis, but what you are capable of, what you will do, what you deserve. He said, "She already knows how to win. She just needs the proof." He was right. He was always right about the things that mattered. What I want to leave you with, the thing that sits at the center of this story, the thing I have turned over and over in the months since, the thing I find myself thinking about when I stand at the kitchen window in the early morning and watch the light come through the oak trees, is this. The people who tried to take everything from me were not strangers. They were not enemies I had made through carelessness or cruelty. They were my children, people I had loved without condition or calculation for their entire lives. And the man who made sure they could not succeed was not an army or a legal team or a brilliant strategy of my own devising. It was my husband, acting from love, in the last year of his life. There is a version of this story where the lesson is about vigilance, about never trusting too completely, never leaving the financial details to someone else, never allowing love to become a form of inattention. That version is not wrong, exactly, but it isn't the version I live with. The version I live with is this. Richard saw clearly when I could not. He carried the vigilance that the demands of caregiving had temporarily cost me. He used the time and the access and the clarity he had to build something that would hold. Not because he expected to be betrayed by his own children, but because he loved me enough to protect against the possibility, That is what love looks like, when it is serious, not the love of gestures and declarations, though Richard was capable of those too. The love of 8 months of careful, patient, thorough work undertaken in secret, for someone else's benefit, at personal cost. I did not know, when I stood at that graveside in the November cold, saying my final goodbyes, that Richard had already given me his last gift. I did not know, when I walked up those front steps to face my children and their flat eyes and their rehearsed cruelty, that I was already holding everything I needed. I did not know that the suitcase they handed me was not a humiliation, but an irony so precise it would have made Richard smile. He would have smiled. I know that. I know him well enough to know that he would have found the whole sequence. The packed suitcase, the envelope, the 4-second transfer. The laughter fading behind me as I walked to the car. Quietly, completely satisfying. He had always appreciated elegant solutions to complex problems. He would have called this one beautifully structured. I agree. I think it was beautifully structured. And to you, watching this today, I want to say something directly. You may be in the middle of your own version of this. You may be the person standing at the bottom of the steps, holding the suitcase, hearing the laughter. Or you may be earlier in the story, sensing the first cracks, filing away the small signs, not yet sure what you are looking at. Whatever you are facing, I want you to hear this. The people who believe they have won because they have taken something from you are almost always wrong about the shape of what they have taken. They think they have taken your power. They have not touched your power. Your power is not in the house or the money or the title or the position. Your power is in what you know and what you can prove, and who you are when everything external has been stripped away. Do not let them convince you otherwise. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, I am asking you to do 3 things right now. First, hit that like button. It takes 1 second, and it helps more people find stories like this one. Second, subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next, because I promise you there is always more to come. And third, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. You know who that person is. Send it to them. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for someone we love is put the right story in front of them at the right time. I am Michelle Calloway. I live in my house, under my husband's oak trees, in the life we built together. And I am still here.